Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar where we are reporting back from the Pink Elephant IT Service Management Conference 2016 and the Pink Think Tank that we ran at that event as we do every year. I'm Rob England, producer of the Pink Think Tank, and with me today is Troy Dumoulin, Vice President of Pink Elephant. Hi, Troy.
Hey, Rob. Good to be with you today. Excited to kind of share what we all did.
Yes, it was a quite successful think tank again, I think, as they all have been, and I think we've got some really interesting results to share today. So let's start by talking about the purpose of the think tank, which is to come up with some pragmatic, actionable advice every year for the attendees at the conference. So we're always looking to come up with something that people can take away and work with, not just do some sort of theoretical navel gazing. But what we do is we get a group of thinkers together in a room and we look at a particular topic every year. And in past years we've looked at things like governance and complex value streams and multiple suppliers and that sort of thing. And this year we looked at a topic which is front of mind for everybody in the industry, which is multi-speed IT.
Yeah, so just light topics, right? Just shooting the breeze.
Yeah. What's interesting, we try and get a topic that is chewy enough to have people to be able to get some, really get our teeth into it, but also, and broad enough that everyone on the panel can contribute, but we still try and stay focused enough to actually produce something within a day, and that can be quite challenging sometimes. So I think we've done quite well each year, as I say, and this one was a good one. So, multi-speed brings in all those concepts like DevOps and Agile and bimodal and all those sort of things. It allows us to consider those, but it's really only looking at one aspect of it, which is the need. Well, we'll come to that in a minute. So, who do we get in the room? So, we have about 8 people on the think tank every year, and this year we had Kathy Kirsch, who's the ITSM office at Allstate. We had Chris Flanagan, who's VP of ITSM and Operations at Prudential, and both of those organisations are looking at multi-speed capabilities and going through transformations in that area. So that was very, they were very salient at representing the practitioner community in that space. Damon Edwards, Managing Partner at DTO Solutions. So Damon has a prominent podcast in the DevOps world, and he's one of the leading thinkers in the DevOps space. And J. Paul Reed from Release Engineering Approaches, and Richard Nasta from Scaled Agile. Those 3 sort of represent the theorists in the fast speed, the new world of multi-speed. And then we had Gary Case, who was our facilitator, who's a Pink Elephant Principal Consultant, Jack Probst, who's also a Pink Elephant Principal Consultant, and Troy, who's on the call with me here, and myself, and we kind of represent the more of the tradition. Even though we are learning about this new space, we also kind of represent the traditional ITSM body of knowledge as well. So between that group, we looked for a diversity of thinking and of approaches to the topic, selecting people who are all sort of published and prominent and active in the community around this whole concept of multi-speed. So the first thing we wrestled with, didn't we, Troy, was the problem statement. As we seem to do every year, it takes a while to sort of do that forming and storming thing, working through terminology and come to some agreement.
Well, you enter so many diverse opinions into the room, but which is the point, by the way, because we don't want to have uniformity of thinking. We all come with our own biases. Biases are normal, but we all kind of look at the elephant from a different perspective, kind of using the analogy of the 7 blind men and the elephant, right? It's the same problem. We just all see it from a different angle. And this is what we ended up trying to get it down to.
Yeah, and we go through that process, as say, every year. And so we hung up on the word speed a bit, as we'll talk about, but in the end we decided that's sort of the most commonly used word in the industry. And so the problem statement was, how do you lead and manage a multi-speed organisation in order to meet the changing demands of the customer? So how do you deal with the reality that either on a temporary or on a permanent basis, your organisation is going to be operating at multiple cadences?
And we looked at it from two perspectives. There's the speed at which the development cycle can operate. So they receive demand and the understanding of how fast can you take requirements and generate those out into actually usable features that are in production. So we'll talk about speed in the concept of the cadence of the production life cycle perspective. But we're also going to talk about it later in the webinar that one of the key things about speed is the fact that it needs to match demand, not necessarily be faster than demand, but at least match. And that's where this multi-speed component comes from. Managing is kind of balancing that demand-supply equilibrium.
Yeah, exactly. So let's look at speed. As I say, we hung up a bit on that word speed. Velocity is probably a better word because it implies speed with direction. And cadence is possibly a better word because speed and velocity both have a implication of fastness about them, whereas this isn't talking about fast speed, it's talking about speed, fast, slow. But because the words have that implication, then cadence is perhaps a better word. But we stuck with speed just because that is the common word in the vernacular, right? And as Troy said, the key thing here is about that cadence being a match to the cadence of the business, so that if the business wants high volatility and fast speed to market and slightly higher risk profiles perhaps, or not, that's not a given, but if they want higher volatility and faster speed to market, then that's one cadence, and if they want extreme stability and perhaps deliberately slow pace of change, then that's a different cadence. And then the challenge is to synchronize those multiple cadences within our organisation and manage the fact that we have these multiple cadences. So then we talked about bimodal, which was interesting because that's a phrase which has great prominence in the industry at the moment, and the think tank panel was unanimous in agreeing that bimodal is an excellent articulation of the problem, but not necessarily the solution, which will be challenging to some people. But what we said was that an organisation should have one mode of thinking, one culture, one approach to how we address problems, but just do so at multiple cadences. So allowing this idea of multiple modes is a dangerous one because it allows a bifurcation of culture. It allows, to have the fast, cool people spring up in one part of the organisation and the boring, old, stodgy, let's stabilise it, legacy part of the organisation. And that creates an us and them situation and a very negative atmosphere around our legacy systems.
So we talked a lot about that, the analogy of a family. So if a parent is to give, lots of love to one child and basically says to the other child, sorry, you guys, you're just, fat, old, and ugly, and we don't want to invest in your education, what kind of functionality does that bring to the family scenario? The reality is bimodal in itself will create more diverse cultures and more, I think, silo thinking. It actually doesn't improve culture, it actually destroys it.
One of the great quotes from the think tank, and of course I've already forgotten who said it, was that legacy is the history of success. In other words, we need to have a positive attitude to our legacy systems because they run our business. And they are by definition successful systems because we're still in business. And so, again, we need to merge the best of that mode 1 and mode 2 thinking of the the conservative legacy and the nimble, innovative, and have a single mode of thinking within our organisation, which we're able to achieve at multiple speeds. So that was the discussion that we had in the think tank about the cadence of the system, and one of the other early topics for conversation at the think tank was the fact that Pink run a survey in preparation for the think tank each year, and as always, we got some really interesting survey results from that. Troy ran the survey, so Troy, tell us about what you found.
Well, it's interesting because we look at data to see what it can inform us of the current problem statement, or if we've got the problem statement correct. And one of the first things we wanted to ask was, how are people handling activities around, let's say, their innovative type processes, their net new creation development practices. And so what we wanted to understand was, currently, do they manage innovation versus then business as usual? And the data that we got back from about 100 different organizations was absolutely, the majority of them have, in essence, the two modes we talked about. There's the group that basically manages all the fun stuff, and the group over here does all the BAU, business as usual. So mode is a reality. That's definitely the case. Then we asked the question about function. Okay, you've got different processes, but you actually have different teams set up. So you've got the fast team and the normal team. I will stay away from the word slow, just the team that does everything else. And it's actually quite interesting. Right down the middle, literally a 50-50% split between the survey participants in this one. So half of them actually have a dedicated team, half of them have different processes. So that means, interesting to note, that 50% of the organization operate at different speeds using different processes with the same organization. That's actually an interesting premise, because that's going to go with where we want to go with the multi-speed premise. Another question we typically ask is, what kind of models are you using out there? And it's interesting, because we do this specific question we use every year, and this year we asked things around lean and agile, and we didn't ask DevOps. I should have probably done that, but we can probably make some assumptions around the agile usage. But the reality is, agile itself and lean are quickly becoming adopted as frameworks to accelerate and improve CSI, continual improvement, and enable innovation. And this is an interesting premise, almost as well, actually, as you can see, agile equals at least, or a little bit exceeds, the waterfall approach, and service management is not that much larger in that context. So the reality is, we have complex organizations. I think this was Damon's flip chart that he wrote. He drew this whole thing up, and he talked about this in the context at the top level. You've got all these user interfaces, and these user interfaces are enabled by different architectures, and some of them are legacy type architectures using classic platforms like mainframes, and other ones are hybrid. And the reality is some of them are built on the web kind of type applications. And the reality is that every organization is going to have multiple different environments, and by the very nature of that environment, by the very architecture of that environment, they will operate at different speeds. A built-on-the-web, self-healing, redundant type of application using microservices simply will be, in nature, a higher accelerated practice from design to production than a older technology, leveraging a mainframe, for example. So the reality is, this world we live in is a complex environment. We like to think about it in the professional context of, IT professor and professional, that what we manage looks like this. This is what we see in our mind when we think about our world and try to picture it. But in the reality, it's probably much more like this. Trying to find where one line ends and one starts is a bit of a dog's breakfast. But the reality is, we live in a complex world. It was interesting premise that we looked at this in the architecture space. So the interesting world we live in is basically never a simple cause and effect. There's many different factors that we have to consider. In fact, as we know, we're not only dealing with internal suppliers, but the reality is the systems we live in are fractal. They connect to systems, which connect to systems, which connect to systems. And this is just the world we live in. So the challenge with the fact that we live in a complex world is it looks more like astrophysics than it does sometimes straight cause and effect. When we understand that we're living in a complex world, we have to treat a complex system differently than an ordered system. And so this is where, in the conversation of the think tank, we had a lot of dialogue around the Cynefin model. And the Cynefin model is out of the systems thinking complexity theory world, but in reality, it simply has a couple of key messages. On the right-hand side of this model, we live in the world of ordered systems. This is where cause and effect is understood, and if I push lever A, then I'll get a direct consequence from B. And that's true in the obvious world. I'll just apply the best practice. In the complicated world, there's still a right answer. There's still an understanding of A equals B equals C, or some combination of therefore will actually equal D. The reality is I'm working still in a understandable context. Where things change as we move to the left-hand side of this model, and this is the unordered system. This is where, in the world of systems thinking, there's too many variances in the agents of the system, and really, we're talking about emergent systems that are difficult simply to have a cause and effect relationship, or be able to guarantee that this aspect that I touch or approve or fix will have a direct impact on a given goal or objective. In complex worlds, we have to actually think about more of levers, where I look at large groupings of agents, and if I apply the right pressure in a couple of key spaces, then this kind of amorphous system blob that I'm working with here will generally move in the right direction. So complex thinking requires a different approach to improvement. This is where we get into experimentation, or in the world of chaos, sometimes we have to stabilize the environment before we can actually then bring ourselves back for time in respect to trying different experiments. This whole concept of complexity and complex systems have a lot to do with understanding multi-speed. Because to understand what accelerates or decelerates the given life cycle, systems life cycle of demand, plan, build, run, we have to think about all the different complexities that come together. Some of these are people aspects, some of them are process aspects, some of them are system and technology, some of them are partner. So the fact is we have too many potential agents which can actually make something go quicker or slow it down. So if we understand that they're not predictable, when we look at and try to manage them as complex systems, we can understand that experimentation, managing a system via finding the right levers to, in a combination, move a various system towards a given direction. This aspect of system thinking helps us to understand what are the different parameters. We're going to talk about that in the think tank session a bit further, that can actually be addressed to basically improve speed to match demand. Anything you want to add there? I know this is an area of interest for you, Rob.
Yes, I think the key message that I want people to take away from this is that a lot of what you hold dear in terms of treating our world as linear, manageable, predictable systems is actually not adequate to deal with the complexity of the world we have confronted with today. And we have to dig out or learn about complex systems theory and understand that they're not completely predictable, that there are these emergent behaviors. There's that primer there, Richard Cook's paper on how complex systems fail, which I always recommend lots of people to dig out and understand. He's talking about a hospital, but that doesn't matter. He's talking about the inherent unmanageability of all complex systems and the fact that we need to deal with failure. Mm-hmm. And then there's these emergent concepts around anti-fragility and stuff we don't have time to go into today, but how systems have to be designed in such a way to actually thrive on failure and grow stronger and learn and build from that.
And so the cause and effect here, getting down to why this is important, is because the think tank thought through a set of different enablers and constraints relative to what either accelerates or decelerates a given system. And that's going to be something that we'll explore with you in a few minutes. So let's talk about the drivers.
Right. So the forces that are on us in our organizations as we confront this issue of multi-speed are, a lot of them are familiar to us. You know, we understand the world that we're in, and so we'll just look briefly at those. There's a recognition that businesses are vulnerable to competition in the modern world, the increased volatility, so we need an accelerated rate not just of value to market, but also of just learning faster. So this whole thing around being willing to fail fast, become a growing, evolving organization drives the need for greater speed. This whole move towards agility and faster cadences in order to be able to behave that way. Dealing with disruptive technologies that we have to respond to very quickly. So not only is it a changing world, but it's a step-changing world. Mm-hmm. So all of those things are driving us. And then at the same time, you've got the old classic do more with less and the driving down of costs within the organization and you know, constantly seeking the ability to drive out waste. So, you know, that leads us towards one of Troy's favorite areas, lean thinking, which addresses both of those by optimizing the pace at which we can get to value and also driving out the waste in that process at the same time. So we're always looking for greater efficiency, and yet at the same time we're constrained by the risks and the risk appetite of the business. And so I like to talk about to protect and serve. We're in this constant dilemma. We're on the horns of a dilemma where at the same time, we are both the custodians of this enormous valuable asset of the organization, which is its information and its technology for manipulating that information. And at the same time, we're expected to serve the organization, which these days primarily means to be able to change quickly. So balancing those protect and serve comes back to the business risk appetite. The business has to set the dial about how much they care about protect and how much they care about serve, and be clear in their understanding of the risk appetite. And then the final driver that is impacting all of this is, of course, the fact that a lot of this capability can be derived externally now. And so not just the cloud, but everything as a service and all the multiple service providers is the final driver that's pushing us along. So this presents some real challenges for us in the achieving of the response to those drivers and achieving this multi-speed capability. I've talked a bit about the protect and serve, finding that balance, finding trading off those two areas and doing so in a way that meets the business needs is important. There are some really damaging myths out there that get in our way. There's the myth that, well, maybe not a myth, but an excessive aspiration that we can all do pure crystalline DevOps tomorrow and we can all be unicorns. But there are all sorts. There's the myth that higher cadence equals risk automatically, which was one of the misapprehensions that I suffered under for a long time. It doesn't. You can, in fact, increase speed and decrease risk if you do it the right way. But there's a number of myths that get in our way. there's the existing culture and leadership of the organisation, of course, and working at how we move those. There are the governance challenges thrown up by the fact that we have multiple cadences and multiple designs of life cycles and all that sort of thing. There's finding a way to come to a point of common shared values between what are actually quite disparate cultures. You know, when we're talking about this bimodal, it's almost in our organisations already. As we said, it's a key part of the problem statement. And trying to move towards a common shared value set within the organisation is a huge challenge, as is moving from systems thinking versus siloed thinking, which is what I'm taking clients through at the moment, and trying to understand the overall system of the organisation, which is why we made such a big deal about complex systems, because that complexity is the challenge that we face. So Troy referred to the fact that there are these enablers that we looked at, the accelerants, the controls on the system. And that's bringing us back to one of your favourite areas, isn't it, Troy?
Well, there's in the concept of governance, and this is kind of a perfect pitch. Thank you, Rob. Governance really talks about putting in place things that must be true for the organization to achieve its stated vision and mission. And these enablers, of course, are not in place, or they're somehow constrained or limited or somehow deficient, then the things that must be true are not there, and then their very lack thereof becomes constraints or something that actually will decelerate, in this case, the desired cadence or speed. And so in that concept of enablers, we talked about, again, back to that system premise, we talked about things which are kind of universal. These things are true across the organization, across all of the participants in the value stream. And then there are specific things, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, which are specific to specific technologies or service elements based on specific architectures. But these things are the true things for all. And so we looked at these enablers in the context of 4 primary domains that you see on this screen here, and they come in the flavor of leadership, culture, organization, and process. And all of these enablers enable or disable the ability to achieve a purpose. So let's take a look at these in a bit more detail. So the world of leadership, we have to have an organization that basically is led by a team of people that believe in value stream thinking collaboration. So they actively lead the change and focus on the fact that if I have a number of different participants in my value stream, so we're talking about people in plan and people in build, people in test, people in run, and if all these people have different expectations around what they're supposed to be doing, different priorities, different beliefs, which we know is probably true in 9 out of 10 organizations listening to this webinar, then the reality is that system will not be efficient or effective, because in essence, everyone's being agile in completely different directions, and it kills the overall velocity. So that means leadership understands this, and they develop people that are aligned in purpose with the mission and purpose of the organization. And they're focusing on that culture of the motivation of the individual that understands that people are really motivated by understanding a couple of key things. They focus on the fact that people enjoy getting better at things. So having time to focus on improvement, having the ability to work in an autonomous manner, so that I actually have the ability to make some decisions within the context of a set of boundaries, like a family house rule premise. But the reality is, I understand within which I can actually operate, and that what I'm doing actually has some objective beyond just me, so I have purpose. So it's not just my department or my specific task as a developer or an operations professional, but I'm in a value system generating outcomes and value that enables the company as a whole to achieve its mission, which ideally is, of course, something positive. Right, so this leadership is focusing on changing a belief system, removing barriers and constraints, understanding that there are people who live in a matrix world, and helping them to have policies to understand when and how to prioritize work based on that matrix. This is an organization that's led by a group of people that understands they're on a team, and that a team is made up of contributing people who all believe they share a common vision and set of goals. If they're just managing IT professionals, each of which is a star quarterback, but they don't have a team premise, then we've got a dysfunctional family, we have a dysfunctional organization. Culture. Culture is all about what the leadership is trying to produce, right? This is that, how do I get you from thinking about just your specific piece of the puzzle, but help you think about the fact that you're in a value system? How can I help you think about optimizing your work in a way that it's lean, so that it's not just focusing on best practice, but we're looking at fit for purpose. We're trying to remove waste and inefficiencies by looking at things from, if the customer had a choice, what would they willingly pay for? And balancing that with some other aspects. But the key is understanding that development only delivers the potential for value. It's not until it's in the hands of the user, the consumer, that we actually have value realization. So this end-to-end premise is critical, where culture looks at it from the point of view of results, which are produced by actions. Those actions are generated from beliefs, and those beliefs are basically founded on experience. So this whole cultural relevance is actually part of the leadership world. I'll turn the next to, go ahead.
I was going to say there's an important point that comes out with culture for me, is that there's a human rate of change, and in IT, we're kind of used to being able to deploy technology and even processes really quickly. But so there's this expectation that because DevOps is to a large extent driven by automation, and a lot of this acceleration is achieved through automation, that therefore we can just deploy some technology and suddenly we'll all be doing really high-speed stuff. And the two slides that you just spoken to about the need for leadership and for cultural change also tell us that it takes a finite time to change a system in this way, and that finite time is measured in months and years, not in days and weeks, right?
Yeah, even if we optimize through automation, a non-constraint, but we haven't looked at the path to production, right? Optimizing the change and release process for low friction, not no friction, but low friction, and optimize that, we don't get what we're looking for. So automation in itself is only one small piece of this overall puzzle.
Exactly. And so as you say, if the process isn't improved, and if the culture isn't improved, then optimized, then it's not going to achieve much.
Well, if you don't have a culture, then you're not going to think about process, because process to you is the one task I'm responsible for, and anything upstream and downstream for me isn't my problem, right? I've got my bumper, you've got your wheel, and she's got the steering wheel, and we can all just do our own thing and somehow build a car. The reality is, without this systems orientation, this value stream orientation, we can't really look at how do we improve things like improve velocity through lead time and cycle time optimization and reduction. How do I identify waste within the entire system? Where are my bottlenecks? How do I improve fast feedback loops by ensuring that I have, proper reflection periods in my development cycle? All of this process conversation you see on the slide right now begins with a leadership and a culture that actually values the fact that you work in a process. And that, if you think about it, is actually quite a rare thing in the IT industry. Would you not agree, Rob?
Oh, absolutely. And we think we've got a process focus, but one of the things I've come to understand through wrestling with this whole multi-speed thing is that there's process and there's system, and it's the ability to think about process at a systemic level across the organization, and process as part of a system and derivative from a system, rather than just incident process in its own right. That is the transformation and thinking that ITSM is being pulled through by all of this.
Yeah, because what we're talking about is a generic process architecture that takes demand, produces that requirement, takes those requirements, builds something of value. verifies that value is actually going to be realized in the build, and then puts it into production in such a way that it doesn't take down the house of cards, and then delivers value on an ongoing basis. So that entire value system, if you only ever do incident, problem, and change, and never go beyond that basic, operations and maybe a little bit of transition set, you never get back to the entire value stream perspective. Yet even understanding service management through a lean value stream lens perspective does exactly what you just said. It puts me into a systemic perspective.
Exactly.
So that means we have to do things that basically organizationally enable us to decrease silo thinking, whether that's creating cross-functional teams or developing individuals into being T-shaped specialists, and that kind of needs a little bit of explanation. But think about the individual who is very task-oriented, very specialized in their work effort. If that's all they think they do and all that they want to be aware of, so I just manage bumpers /servers /applications /databases, nothing else is my problem. What you have there is a very basically I-shaped person. And I guess that's an interesting thing, an I-shaped person. But it's kind of very self-centered and self-centric. A T perspective understands that, yes, you are a specialist within a specific task. That's what you're paid for, and you're valued for that. But you also understand that you're in a value system, and you know what the context left and right of you is. So you understand and have some actually skills also that might be beyond your specialism. So T-shaped people understand they're in a larger context, a larger system. So this whole premise of creating structures and roles, enterprise process owners, enterprise service owners, service management is all about this, is creating structure that promotes value stream orientation. So what do we do with this? Well, so first of all, go back to the enablers. So if any one of those enablers, by the way, the premise of enabler, as we kind of entered into that discussion, means that these things must be true for the organization to operate according to its shared value and vision and mission. So the improvements, of course, would be you can do an assessment around the enablers, what's missing, what's lacking, or what's completely deficient. But improvement can also go in a bit more granular perspective. So we looked at this, and this is actually one of the awesome deliverables that came out of the premise of this various discussions we had at the think tank. We looked at when we've started to create a very high-level, albeit rudimentary assessment method, but looking at the enablers we just went through, but also specific levers, we called them. And think about this. A lever, think about a dip switch, where you have three positions of the dip switch. There's the neutral position, there's a up position, which means in this model something that accelerates, and then there's a down position. So any of these things we've talked about so far could be either a neutral, meaning it has no impact, an accelerator, its strength is actually enabling speed, or it actually, in its deficient capacity, is slowing things down. Those are the enablers, but there's also a set of levers which are system or service specific, and we won't go through all of those here, but you can actually think about it this way. So some examples to throw off the top of my head here. The architecture. So if it is a built-on-the-web microservices architecture, you're going to have a higher acceleration. If it's a hybrid where you have part virtual, part classic infrastructure, then you will have a neutral. And if it's all physical, then you probably have a decelerator. Other ones we talked about would be the willingness of the organization to work in small batch incremental improvements. So this is the premise of a sprint. So the appetite for small batch working would be either up, meaning a high appetite, down, meaning I'm never going to do that, or you have in the middle, you have kind of a modified version of some of it's waterfall, some of it's more agile. Other ones, Rob, we had about 14 or 15 of these levers that were either accelerators or decelerators. Yes. Anything you want to pull out as kind of examples?
One of the ones that springs out to me is always the legacy debt, the technical debt. And No, I think there's a whole bunch of them. We'll pull them out. We'll pull them out as we come along.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are just examples. And so we came up with the list of enablers and a list of levers, basically, that allowed us to map, and the interesting thing is even evaluate with a scored system whether the various system elements would contribute to acceleration or deceleration, which then allowed us to say, okay, if we know what the potential elements for accelerate or decelerate are, how do we leverage these for making improvements? Well, and if we know where these levers are, what kind of accelerators can we actually throw in to actually improve each one? So these are some examples. So True North, this is a premise where the leadership of the organization have established a clear vision and mission, and everyone shares an understanding of common belief and prioritization. The ability to work in small batch mode versus larger waterfall premise. That you're looking at short feedback loops in your development cycle. So the reality is you're doing quick feedback loops for iterative design based on user stories, and this is very agile, like shifting quality to the left. And you can do this in a variety of different ways. In the automation premise of DevOps, you're basically building automated testing into your design of your architecture. If you're not into or don't have the capability to do automatic testing, you can actually do practices like dual programming, where you have paired up your programmers for check and balances against each other, or you're doing small batch incremental quality assurance. Reality is you can find ways to stop defects from moving down the line further to production. Improving another one would be how to use visual management. So a Kanban board, for example, is another way to accelerate. What you don't see, you can't manage. You can't manage the invisible. So taking that work practice, this work stream, this value stream, and putting it into a Kanban board allows you to visualize how work is flowing or not across this value system. WIP optimization. If I'm looking at a specific activity now in my value system and I see a significant amount of inventory in front of this bottleneck, and I have to find a way to basically optimize the flow through that task or that activity. So all of these are aspects of how you would potentially find your way to accelerating specific levers that are currently in a down position or neutral. Not to go through each one. Again, the white papers that we come up with will actually be talking more about this. Anything else before I move on?
Well, I do think the automation one fascinates me because I've always been a technology skeptic in the past, and you can do incident management with a set of post-it notes if you want to. Technology's optional, but in this space, automation has become non-negotiable. The only way to have a high cadence and keep your risks low is to automate.
Absolutely. So there are many different accelerators that we discussed that actually could be applied. So A, understand your enablers. B, what are the specific system-oriented, architecturally-oriented aspects which will accelerate or decelerate? And then once you know what those levers are, what accelerators can you apply to each lever to basically speed up? So you're flipping more of the switches into the up position. But again, one of the key things we said earlier was it's not about just moving everything up to some kind of infinite speed. What you're also going to need to understand is what is the rate of incoming demand. And as long as the rate of incoming demand is equal to the speed of supply, that's fine. So you just have to flip enough switches to understand where you find some equilibrium between the incoming and the development cycle and cadence. And you simply know what that happens because you'll see that the queue in front of development is becoming more manageable. If it's growing, then you have a problem with speed. You have a problem with cadence. So the key aspect here is that you're going to have multiple systems which will have multiple speeds based on the reality of the multiple factors of the system. As long as that system is operating at the speed of requirement, all good. The focus here is flow. Understanding how do I improve flow to basically meet and basically achieve that equilibrium of demand and supply. And there's different ways to do it based on our conversation, identifying the constraints, driving out waste. And all of the above is how we either accelerate or leave alone a various system. Over to you for roadmap.
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting here is how do you go forward with this? And actually, this is a very short slide to talk about because the bottom line is that, as we said earlier on in the presentation, this is all about changing the culture of an organisation. This isn't just about rolling out some tools. This is about fundamentally changing the way people think and act and trying to do that in a systemic manner, which means that really you have to be talking about an organisational level change, not just some team. So you're talking about cultural change, and it's cultural change like any other cultural change. So the considerations at that level are the same as they would be for any organisation level transformation. You know, there's the good old Kotter's 8 steps to organisational change, which has long been discussed and used. There's the more modern or more recent thinking around Kaizen as an approach to organisational change. There's ITIL's 6-step improvement. There's the Six Sigma and DIMAC, right? There's any number of, the point of this slide is there's any number of methodologies and approaches and tools to use for cultural change, and this change is no different to any other one. So the last thing that we always do in these things is something that's a theme at Pink Elephant conferences, and I'm always impressed by it, is, you know, what do you do Monday? So this is all well and good, but when you get back to work, what does it mean? So some of the things we came up with that you can start thinking about right away with this stuff is go and find out about complex systems and understand what it means and some of the models around this and get your head around it. The whole language and thinking of complex systems is a different space. Start thinking about the value streams in your organisation. Potentially get some expertise in to help you do value stream analysis and mapping it. Make sure or start thinking about a cultural change program, because, as I say, if all you think about is the technology and the processes, this isn't going to work. You've got to think about cultural change. There are architecture and technology implications to this. So understanding what the architectural and technological constraints of your organisation is the place to start, and then start trying to influence the directions of those. One of the things I've come to understand is the importance of a service-oriented architecture and the ability to abstract things and have a much greater granularity of the pieces that we can aggregate. And obviously automation as well are important futures. So, you know, that's a whole area to start getting your head around. Likewise, the people space and thinking about starting the journey of skilling people up with this stuff. And so in that space, then the thing that sticks out is probably, let's assume that a lot of people understand Agile already. If not, then that's the place to start. But otherwise, you know, start thinking about this DevOps thing and get your head around that, because it's coming fast. And you know, it's not everybody's going to be doing it everywhere tomorrow, but everybody needs to understand DevOps.
Was that a pun? It's coming fast.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's really accelerating the. It's funny, yes. Yeah. And then, as Troy talked about, your governance and your leadership models need to understand this changing pace. A really simple example of that I love is funding models for stuff. So traditionally, we've treated the project as CapEx and the ongoing operations as OpEx. But if you're doing an agile iterative approach, and if you're going to do 10 iterations before go live and another 20 iterations after go live to an indeterminate number, then which ones of those are CapEx activities and which ones of those are OpEx? And it actually does the head-in of a lot of traditional governance and leadership thinkers when you pose that question. So there's all these, you've got to start thinking about the transformation of those models. Ensure that the right education's happening. Again, I think that comes back to the Agile DevOps stuff as something that it's not a weird group of people in the corner sitting on Swiss balls anymore. You know, this is mainstream stuff that we all need to have in our tool bag as things that we understand and can use. And finally, and controversially, stop talking about bimodal as a solution, we think it's a very good problem statement. So, what can you expect next from the think tank? So, we're going to put together, as we have done in the past, some white papers to gather together and further improve and evolve the IP, the ideas that we developed in the think tank, and to improve that analytical tool that we put together, and particularly to provide advice to you. We will try hard to produce other multimedia stuff around that again, like, for example, this very webinar that you're listening to at the moment. So, any last thoughts, Troy, on?
I think we have our work cut out for us, Rob. So we've had some really good discussion, but it really comes down to the stuff that comes out now, and we have a good idea what we want to do. So look for that over the next 3 to 4 months and into the summer time frame. You'll see a series coming out, being published by Pink Elephant, then free to download.
And feel free, of course, to reach out to Troy or myself with any thoughts or feedback or comments or ideas of what you'd like to see. And we look forward to talking to you again with some further outputs.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate it. And everyone, see you at the next Pink 17.
Yes, quite right. Thanks. Bye.